Ashland, Indiana was cold and dry on Monday morning. A thin layer of frost coated the tops of containers lined up behind Depot 9, the fourth largest warehouse in the logistics chain owned by Reeves Distribution. An old Ford pickup truck pulled into the employee lot. A man stepped out, pulled his baseball cap low, and scanned the area as if calculating an escape route. No one recognized him. No one cared. In this place, people came in for their shift, worked, and disappeared like the parcels sliding across the conveyor belts. No names, no time for questions. His real name was Colton Reeves, 42 years old, CEO of all 17 warehouses spread across the Midwest. But today, everyone would know him by a different name, Mitch Carter. No one knew that the man entering the shift, wearing work gloves and a silver gray hoodie, was the same person who signed the lease for the entire property. The one who once spoke on CNN about performance culture and trust. Now he was standing at the back door of Depot 9, the branch labeled as stable, yet plagued by unusually high turnover, delayed shipments, and most recently, an insignificant accident not requiring formal report. Colton didn't believe in coincidences. He had sat in too many meetings where data was dressed up for appearances, not truth. A few weeks earlier, an internal HR report had suggested that certain supervisors may be adjusting performance metrics to secure KPI bonuses. All soft language, but he knew exactly what it meant. Ray, the morning shift manager, was the first to speak to him. "Nick, right?" the man asked in a raspy voice, his eyes foggy behind dew-covered glasses. "I'm Ray, shift lead here. You're on Dock 9 today. Follow me." No employee badge, no greeting, not even a sheet with basic procedures. Just orders in the cold path between towering shelves. Colton nodded, kept his voice hoarse. "Got it." He pulled his cap lower and followed Ray through stacks of pallets and the endless clatter of conveyor belts. The air inside the warehouse wasn't just thick with diesel fumes and grime. It was heavy with an eerie silence. No conversations between workers, only hurried footsteps, wooden slats slamming into containers, and occasionally Ray shouting at someone for being too slow. An older black man passed by, glanced briefly at Colton, gave a faint nod, then lowered his head and went back to work. A young Latina woman struggled to carry a box too heavy for her frame, but no one helped. Everyone kept their eyes down, as if this place had taught them that making eye contact was dangerous. Ray led Colton to a man hunched over, struggling to adjust a misaligned pallet. "This is Emilio. Stick with him, learn fast, and don't ask dumb questions. Anyone who slows the line down loses their shift pay." With that, Ray walked off. Emilio straightened up, deep-set eyes and a bent back clearly showing signs of spinal degeneration. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Mitch," Colton replied. Emilio nodded. "Know how to run a pallet jack?" "No." "Then start by learning how not to get your foot crushed by one." They started working. No posted schedules, no floor supervisors, no clear guidance. Just Emilio pointing out each move by hand, scanning barcodes, avoiding blind spots, stacking boxes so they wouldn't slide. Colton's back began to ache after just 2 hours. But what bothered him more than the physical pain was the numbing silence. Everyone around him worked like machines. No small talk, no laughter, nothing to make the place feel remotely human. During the mid-shift break, if it could be called that, Emilio brought Colton to the break room. In reality, it was a space barely the size of an old restroom, with a broken vending machine, 2 cracked plastic chairs propped up by cardboard boxes, and a flickering fluorescent light. A middle-aged woman with a back brace winced as she lifted her coffee from the table, and a young man stretched his shoes lined with toilet paper to keep out the damp. No one spoke, just the uneven hum of an overworked fan, as if it too were exhausted. Colton noticed the wall of posters, most of them peeling. At the center was an old Reeves Logistics logo, faded lettering, and beneath it the slogan he had personally launched during the Building Trust campaign 8 years ago. "No one gets left behind." Someone had used correction fluid to erase the word "no." Now it read only, "One gets left behind." Colton stared at it for a long moment, not out of anger, but because he remembered who had written that slogan. It was him, and back then, he truly believed it could change the company culture. Back at Dock 9, Sunlight slanted across the cracked, damp concrete floor. But no one looked up, not even Emilio. The people here didn't lift their heads because they had learned that if you kept your head down long enough, low enough, you drew less attention, got yelled at less, and were less likely to become the target of something worse than fatigue: invisibility. And in that windowless warehouse, Colton Reeves, the man once praised by Forbes as the architect of modern logistics systems, was beginning to see a truth he had long ignored. The system wasn't broken. It was hollow from within. The afternoon shift began, and though the weather outside hadn't turned truly hot yet, it was a different story inside the warehouse. The air was stagnant. The smell of engine oil mixing with damp fabric from leftover stock made it hard for anyone entering to breathe. On the floor of Dock 9, everyone kept their heads down, working without pause. Colton, or rather Mitch, had gotten more comfortable handling the pallet jack and stacking loads. But the sharp pain in his back reminded him that 42 was not an ideal age to start over from scratch. Emilio, on the other hand, was just as he had been in the morning. No complaints, no breaks, not even a second spared. When Colton whispered, "Don't you ever take a break?" Emilio simply chuckled, a laugh void of any joy. "Here, we're not allowed to sit unless we pass out." He said it like a joke, but Colton couldn't even smile. Emilio's back was bent like a wire hanger. One sole of his shoes had torn open, but he still dragged wet pallets like his life depended on each slippery track. "Ray says chairs make people slow. Get your body used to slacking, and you lose productivity," Emilio added, his tone flat, as if reciting a slogan stamped into every shift. Colton merely nodded, but inside, every fiber of him was tense. He started observing more closely. Each worker on Dock 9 moved as if programmed. Move, stack, return, repeat. There were no pauses, no spacing, and absolutely no laughter. Toward the far edge of the warehouse, he noticed a figure bent over picking something up. A black woman, probably in her early 40s, wearing a hoodie with a frayed collar and an uneven gait. When she lifted the box, Colton saw her biting her lower lip in pain. Not the usual kind of pain, but the kind that tears open an old wound. He stepped closer. "Need help?" he asked. She looked up, eyes flickering with fear. "No, I'm okay." She smiled, a practiced kind of smile designed to deflect, not to engage. "I'm Mitch," he said softly. "Tasha," she replied, then bent down to continue working as if he had never spoken. At that moment, Ray strode over and barked, "Tasha! Don't carry like that. Move faster. Zone 4 is waiting on a pallet." She nodded instantly, forcing the pallet forward with both hands, even as her left leg visibly trembled. Colton narrowed his eyes. Someone clearly injured, yet unacknowledged. No medical oversight, no physical support, no report. Everything brushed aside like dust. Just wipe and move on. After Ray walked off, Colton stepped closer and whispered, "Your leg's hurt, isn't it?" Tasha looked around before giving a slight nod. "Old injury, but it's gotten worse this week. I told him." Ray said, "If I take leave, my request becomes my resignation." Colton clenched his fist but kept his expression calm. "Anyone else know?" he asked. Tasha shook her head. "Everyone's got their own problems. Around here, reporting just makes things worse." Just then, a stack of papers slipped from her hoodie pocket. Colton bent down to pick them up and glimpsed grids with handwritten time slots, dates, and the name Ray scratched out in red in multiple blocks. "What's this?" he asked. Tasha blushed and quickly took them back. "Nothing. I log my own shifts to avoid working when he's on duty. Just makes it easier to breathe." Colton said nothing, but he understood. In a system where managers held unchecked power, workers had to create their own survival maps. Not to get ahead, but simply to avoid being crushed. Emilio came over. "She's still the best on Dock 4, even with her leg," he said quietly, just loud enough for Colton to hear. "It's just, no one in management cares." Colton swallowed hard. Tasha turned away and dragged the next pallet like the conversation had never happened. He stood there for a moment, like a man who had just uncovered a secret no one wanted revealed. This place didn't need supervision. It ran on fear. Colton began to notice the smaller details. A security camera in the corner no longer blinked. An emergency exit tied shut with wire. A dangling first aid box that contained only a few Band-Aids and 2 expired cold tablets. Each item like a thin slice, and the more he saw, the clearer it became. This wasn't a system with cracks. It was a system already rotten, repainted every week to look whole. At the end of the shift, Emilio braced his hands on his knees and sighed. You feel that slight tremble on the floor? Drain trench underneath? Wasn't installed right. But Ray says keep going. Don't report it. Fixing it means delayed shipments. Colton looked up at the ceiling, where the light bulbs had dimmed, then down at Emilio, whose hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. What if I don't see you here tomorrow, he asked. Emilio chuckled softly. Then you'll learn something. Those who never sit fall the hardest. Colton didn't answer. He stood there in the slowly emptying Dock 9 as the light outside turned to deep amber. No one said goodbye. No one looked back. Only the sound of pallets dragging and the scent of melting plastic mixed into the air. He knew this wasn't an operational issue. This was a place where people existed as tools. And the worst part was, he had once unknowingly taught people like Ray how to manage exactly like this. Tuesday, 7:08 a.m. The sunlight hadn't yet pierced through the lingering mist, but inside Depot 9, the heat had already begun creeping through the gaps in the low ceiling. Colton walked in with his gloves still damp from the day before, his back still aching, and his left calf feeling like it was weighed down with stone. But his mind had never been clearer. He wasn't here to work. He was here to listen, to trace each thread of a fabric that was slowly rotting. Ray stood on the distribution floor like he did every morning, clipboard in hand, eyes devoid of warmth. Nick, he called out, you're heading to Base 7. There's a container that needs sorting. Just open it and bring the front boxes into the warehouse. Don't touch the back half. Got it? Colton tilted his head. Why not sort the back half? Ray squinted, sneered. Because I said so. Then turned away, offering no further explanation. Colton stood still for a few seconds, partly surprised, partly intrigued. A faint signal stirred in his brain, the instinct of a man who had run logistics chains for nearly 2 decades. Base 7 was tucked away in a corner of the container yard, rarely trafficked. The metal sliding door was scratched and dulled, with patches of paint peeled off as if it hadn't been serviced since the warehouse opened. Colton stepped forward, slipped his hand under the handle, took a breath, and yanked it up. The door screeched in jolting intervals, like metal waking from a forced slumber. The first thing he saw was familiar cargo, cardboard boxes filled with paper rolls, bottled water, food packaging. But as he stepped in a few feet further, he stopped. A sharp, acrid stench hit him harder than anything he'd ever inhaled. A chemical smell, not detergent, not paint, but something synthetic enough to make the skin on his neck recoil. At the back of the container, near the wall, stood 5 metal drums, the kind typically used for storing industrial solvents. No labels, no DOT codes. One of the barrels was dented and had a leak near the bottom, where a thick, dark brown liquid had seeped out into a long, blood-like streak across the metal floor. Colton stepped back. His heart pounded. A chain of questions raced through his mind. What is this stuff? Why is it next to food supplies? Why wasn't anyone warned? And most importantly, why did Ray know and still tell him not to touch it? You saw it, didn't you? A familiar voice said from behind. Emilio. He walked over, his face like stone. It's been here since last month. Ray told everyone not to ask. No one's allowed to report it. Said it was temporary storage. But if it's just temporary, then why's there no manifest? Why no sign-off? Colton looked at him, then back at the leaking chemical drum. A faint burn mark on the floor nearby suddenly made everything clear. This wasn't carelessness. It was neglect. He slammed the door shut with both hands, latched it, then leaned against the cold metal container. Eyes closed, he inhaled deeply. But what filled his lungs wasn't air. It was the truth. Something was seriously wrong. He returned to Dock 9's makeshift office. Originally a record storage room, now reused to hold clipboards, empty water jugs, and freight logs from recent shipments. Pretending to search for paperwork, he sifted through stacks of old documents. A shipping manifest from 5 years ago, approved by Central HQ. There it was, a familiar name printed in the top right corner under Authorized Logistics Executive, Colton Reeves. He froze. Even though it had been scanned, photocopied, and smudged with time, the name was unmistakable. The order had been authorized by him, not signed by hand, but his role had opened the door for those chemicals to enter the supply chain from the very beginning. His hands began to tremble. He remembered that year, in an effort to cut out middleman costs, he'd approved a pilot program to source directly from a non-regulated supplier to test the supply chain's flexibility. A small trial, a strategic decision. And then, when the results came back inconclusive, the program was shelved. But the initial batch, it had remained somewhere. Now it was here, leaking, unlabeled, sitting beside food products. Emilio entered. "You okay?" Colton gave a faint nod. "Yeah." But he wasn't. He couldn't be. Not after realizing he had, however unintentionally, planted the seed for the very thing that was now rotting the entire system. A chain reaction he never imagined, or worse, had once seen and chosen to ignore. Back on the warehouse floor, Colton was quieter, more alert. The chemical stench wasn't just a smell anymore. It became a haunting, a reminder every time he bent down to lift a box, every time Ray's voice echoed, "Hurry up, next batch coming down the belt." Ray passed by him, paused for a second, eyes sharp like blades. "I told you not to touch the back half," he said, not loudly, but just enough for those nearby to hear. Colton looked up, calm. "I didn't touch it." Ray gave a small nod, smirked. "Good. People who play it smart last longer around here." And then he walked away. Colton stood still, as if splashed with cold water. Not because of Ray, but because he realized this system wasn't collapsing from one big mistake. It was collapsing under the weight of 1,000 tiny ones. Things no one inspected, no one spoke about, no one took responsibility for. And 5 years ago, he had been one of those people. Wednesday morning, sunlight had just begun to slant through the rusted metal slats of Depot 9, but inside it remained as dim as always. No one spoke on the warehouse floor. No one asked about the lingering chemical odor that clung like a ghost to Bay 7. No one questioned why that container door had been sealed with old duct tape. Everything was dealt with through silence, the kind taught indirectly by fear. Colton entered wearing a light jacket over his hoodie, eyes sunken from lack of sleep, but his mind sharpened like ground steel. Today he wasn't here to listen. He was here to remember. The shift began as usual. Ray showed up on time, barking commands instead of giving guidance. "Devin, you're on the new shipment at Bay 5. Devin, the youngest guy on the morning shift, thin, with eyes that always looked halfway closed, rushed toward the unopened stack. Colton was stacking pallets on the far end when he heard a faint hiss, then a sharp yelp. He turned. Devin had backed away from a torn cardboard box, and a milky white liquid was quickly spreading across his shoes like a mild acid. "Shit!" Devin hissed, yanked his shoes off, then bent down to see the skin on his foot turning red in streaks, like an instant sunburn. He ran toward the water spout. Ray didn't move. He just shouted, "Rinse it off and get back to work. No time for that nonsense." Colton dropped the pallet he was holding and hurried toward Devin. The bleach-like smell hit him hard, like someone had uncapped a bottle of undiluted ammonia. On the floor, the liquid was creeping along the slip marks left by Devin's shoes. Devin sat with one leg curled, face twisted in pain, clutching his swelling left ankle. "It soaked through the sock," he said. "Feels like a mild burn." Colton didn't respond. He pulled out his personal phone, not the company-issued one for CEOs, but the burner phone he'd been using in disguise, and took 3 quick photos. One of Devin's foot, one of the leaking box, and one of the floor where the bleach had spread. No one stopped him. No one dared. Ray approached, eyes narrowing when he saw Colton with the phone. "What's that, Nick? Taking pictures for what?" His voice was lower, not out of fear, but suspicion. Colton tucked the phone into his pocket. "In case we need to file a safety report." Ray chuckled, dry and sharp. "No need. It's not worth a report. Just a shipment slip." So does he need medical attention? Colton asked. Ray waved his hand dismissively. Water'll do. We don't log injuries for surface scratches. You're new. Don't drag protocol in here. He turned away like what had just happened was no more than a minor hiccup in the workflow. Devin sat for a few minutes, then stood up with a limp. No one helped. Colton offered his arm and walked him to the break room. Inside, everything was the same. Broken vending machine, cracked chairs, flickering light like everything was being electrocuted from within. Devin sat down and pulled off his shoe. The skin around his ankle had flushed an angry red, with several small blisters beginning to form. Colton handed him a cup of water. This ever happened to you before? Devin nodded, lips trembling. Once. Last week, Marcy, the girl on Bay 2, she got dizzy, headaches, then her hair started falling out in chunks. They said it was stress, but she'd been assigned to clean that container in Bay 7. Colton's heart pounded. Hair loss? Yeah, she cried for a whole week. But Ray said, if you can't handle it, leave. She stayed. Colton didn't say another word. He stepped out, heading toward the small office. Not to talk to Ray, but to make a call. He pulled out his personal phone, stood by the rear door, just out of the camera's line of sight, and dialed the private number for the Regional Safety Division, a number he'd always saved but never used. As the dial tone rang, he drew a slow, deep breath. This is Colton Reeves, he said, voice steady and measured. I'm currently on site at Depot 9. A worker has come into contact with an unidentified chemical. No label, no handling instructions. Suffered burns. No report filed. The floor manager has ordered it not be recorded. I want an inspection team here immediately. Quiet, but with full authority. This is not a one-off mistake. This is systemic. He hung up. Didn't wait for a reply. Back on the warehouse floor, he saw Marcy, hair tied low, hard hat on, eyes red but still working. Her face was pale, but her hands moved boxes without missing a beat. He approached. You holding up? Marcy looked up. Still got hair, so I guess I'm fine. She smiled faintly, but the smile cracked halfway through. Did you ever report what happened? I wrote a letter, she said, no hesitation. Put it in the suggestion box. A week later, the box was locked. Colton nodded. She turned away back to work, as if no one had asked, as if no one had ever cared. And then he understood. This warehouse didn't run on machinery. It ran on silence. But he would be silent no longer. Thursday. No one knew that morning would be unlike any other in the history of Depot 9. Not because the conveyor belts were delayed, not because of understaffing, not because shipments arrived off schedule, but because, for the first time, a white SUV pulled up to the main entrance at exactly 6:55 a.m. The vehicle bore no company logo. No one stepped out in a hurry. No sirens. No oversized name badges. But Colton recognized it immediately. It was from the Regional Safety Division, and the woman in the driver's seat was Sherry Dolan, a regional compliance officer known for shutting down 2 branches with a single inspection. Stepping out alongside her was a man in a pale shirt, wearing a small name tag, Victor Hall, a representative from the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. Ray wasn't present when they entered. The office lights were still off. Workers were still waiting for shift assignments. Colton stood among the crowd, saying nothing, not stepping back. He wanted to witness everything, every second. 7:03. Sherry knocked on the office door. A minute later, Ray opened it, holding a paper cup of coffee and wearing a clearly irritated expression. What is this? He asked. Sherry didn't answer. She simply handed over a clipboard with an official order. Victor walked past, immediately starting to review freight logs, camera placement, and safety access routes. Ray floundered. There was no notice. You can't just... Sherry cut him off. Yes, I can, and I am, within full authority. The entire warehouse fell into silence. Workers gathered closer, as if drawn by a strange magnetic force. No one spoke, but the look in their eyes had changed. It was no longer hollow. It was expectant. Victor headed straight to Base 7, opened the container, stepped back immediately, covering his nose. Unlabeled chemical, leaking, no warning signs, no warehouse record. He turned toward Ray. You didn't report this? Ray stammered. I didn't know. It was just a temporary drop. Then why did you instruct staff not to open it? Sherry pressed. Because it wasn't part of their assigned tasks, Ray argued. Victor's expression didn't shift. So you just admitted you knew about it and failed to report. He turned to Sherry. I recommend immediate suspension, sealing off Base 7, and filing a preliminary violation report with the state of Indiana. Sherry nodded. Ray Morgan, as of this moment, you are no longer authorized to manage this facility. She looked to a security officer, part of the inspection team, and gestured. Ray froze, his coffee falling to the floor. No one moved to support him. No one spoke on his behalf. This is a joke, right? Ray shouted. There's no company rep here. You can't just take some worker's word for it. At that moment, Sherry turned and scanned the warehouse. Then who is the authorized company representative at this facility? I need someone with authority to sign the initial inspection record. The entire floor went still. Colton stepped forward. Among dozens of stunned faces, he removed his hard hat, pulled down the hood of his sweatshirt, and lifted his head. His voice was clear, steady. I'm Colton Reeves. This is my company. The room froze. A few employees gasped. Emilio, standing near the back, couldn't form a sound. Ray, being escorted past, locked eyes with Colton as if he'd just been struck with a block of concrete. No way, he mumbled. Victor remained silent for a few seconds. Then he simply stepped forward and held out the report. Do you have authority to sign on site? Colton nodded and signed. Every step of the procedure continued in silence. But it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of shock. A woman whispered in the corner, He worked with us all week, just like one of us. A stooped, brown-skinned man gave a slight nod. No applause, no cheering. But the air in the warehouse shifted. Light didn't pour from the fixtures, but from something far clearer. Justice was standing among them, in the form of a man wearing a faded silver hoodie. Sherry began preliminary witness interviews. Victor posted a closure notice on Base 7. An emergency response team was called to deal with the leaking drums. Colton didn't return to his office. He stayed on the floor, still Mitch, not Colton Reeves, the CEO. A young worker asked, So, you knew everything from the start? Colton shook his head. I came to understand, and now I do. The young man nodded. Well, I guess now no one can pretend it's not real anymore. Colton said nothing. He just stood there watching as the SUV trunk opened, revealing OSHA's red-stamped documentation, then turned back inside. The feeling inside him wasn't pride. It was weight. Because what he'd uncovered wasn't just negligence. It was a rotted culture he himself had helped lay the foundation for. That afternoon, the sun outside Depot 9 beat down hard on the concrete lot, casting sharp shadows of workers walking between loading bays. But inside, no one talked about the weather. No one mentioned lunch break. Everyone was still trying to process what had just happened. Ray had been escorted out. Base 7 was sealed. And the man who had once dragged a pallet jack and swept the floor was now the CEO, the head of the entire system. Colton hadn't gone anywhere. After signing the inspection report with the visiting officials and speaking privately with Sherry, he returned to the exact spot where he had been working. Dock 9. No hard hat, no more sidelong glances from coworkers. Only silence, but not the kind born of fear. This was the silence of anticipation, waiting to see what he would do next. And he knew he couldn't let this pass like just another inspection. He gathered everyone. No microphone, no podium. He stood right in the middle of the warehouse with sunlight slicing through the gaps in the metal walls, casting bright streaks across his face like stage lights. I'm not going to say Ray is the cause of everything. His voice was calm, low, but clear. He holds responsibility, that's obvious. But he didn't do it alone. He acted within a system, and I'm the one who built it. All eyes turned toward him. I once approved operational policies without asking the people actually doing the work. I read reports and never made it past the third line. I thought as long as shipments arrived on time, everything else could be fixed later. He paused for a beat. But I was wrong. And the biggest mistake wasn't a single decision. It was that I left the door open, but turned my back on what walked through it. No one interrupted. Emilio stood off to the left, arms crossed, eyes locked forward. Marcy crouched near a pallet, hair tied back, no longer looking away. Devin leaned against a column, his legs still wrapped, but his face less tense. Colton turned to the row of time card desks. I'm not appointing a new supervisor yet, but I do need someone to keep this place steady while we reset. He looked toward the far end of the room, where a graying man was hammering a wheel back into a pallet jack with a mallet and rivets. Eli, he called out. The man looked up, slightly startled. How long have you been here? Over 9 years, Eli replied, his voice rough. Can you keep things running for now? Not to command, just to make sure no one gets hurt. The loads stay upright, and voices don't get ignored. Eli glanced around, then nodded. I'll try. No, Colton said. You don't have to try. Just keep doing what you've always done. Only now, someone's listening. The warehouse was quiet, but it was no longer bleak. Colton walked to the side office, pulled out his personal laptop, the one he had stashed under the driver's seat for 4 days. He opened the folder marked Archive Reports, scrolled to an email flagged Low Urgency Logistics Review, Q3 2022. Inside was a handwritten report submitted from Depot 9, dated last October, signed by an auxiliary warehouse staffer, a warning about chemical odors, and a recommendation to remove a container stored for over 60 days. The name listed under Report Received by Colton Reeves. He remembered. He had read the subject line, seen no red flag, and clicked Acknowledged. No reply, no forward, no action. A 3-second gesture, leading to 30 weeks of silence. Colton printed the report, carried the hard copy to the break room, pinned it to the bulletin board, right next to the temporary leave notice from Ray, which had already been removed. This is the report I once received, he said, and this is what I didn't do. He returned to the laptop, opened the shift schedule, sent an immediate request to HR to dispatch 3 temporary workers to Depot, 9 starting the next morning. No approval chain, no meeting. We're short-staffed, he said to Eli, and I won't leave you and this team behind for even one more day. Eli nodded. I don't expect you to be perfect, but at least you're here. Colton lingered for a moment, looking at the steel frame of the loading doors, the concrete floor scarred with drag marks, the faces of people who once thought he was just another temp, and who were now watching him, waiting for him to do what no one ever had before. Listen and stay. Friday morning, Depot 9 no longer felt like the same place. The air inside the warehouse wasn't thick with suspicion anymore. It was heavy with anticipation. For the first time in years, workers showed up earlier than their scheduled check-in time, not out of fear that Ray would penalize them, but out of curiosity about what might happen next. Colton arrived at 6:30. No hard hat, no disguise. He was fully himself now, but still wore the same faded silver hoodie he'd had on since his first day at the warehouse, perhaps intentionally, or as a quiet reminder that sometimes to start over, you have to put back on the very thing that once made you bow your head. Eli was rearranging the shift board. Each name was written out fully, no abbreviations, no number codes replacing identities. To him, Jeremiah C. wasn't JC-04. He was a father of 3 on the morning shift, who had once been forced to work 3 consecutive shifts in a single week to cover the gaps. Colton approached the board. New people? He asked. Eli nodded. 3 temps from the support team arrived. I've got them getting used to the system. As for Marcy, I assigned her to manage Bay 2 today. She's sharp, just needs someone to believe it. Colton nodded, his eyes scanning toward the far end of the warehouse, where Marcy moved between stacked parcels, checklist in hand, eyes darting from task to task like everything depended on her. When he neared her, she paused. No flinching, no evasive eyes, just Marcy, hair neatly tied back, chemical burn bandage still on her arm, standing straight and steady. You doing okay? Colton asked. Marcy pressed her lips together. Still get a little dizzy in the mornings, but I'm learning to listen to my body. Colton gave a faint smile. I want to nominate you for the internal supervisor training program. She froze. Me? Yes. No one remembers you because you were quiet, but you're the reason the system started moving. She didn't say anything, just nodded slowly. A nod that seemed to be both an acceptance and an apology for once not believing she had real value. Colton handed her a folder, a 6-week supervisory program, a blend of theory and hands-on practice, with a mentor assigned. "You'll need a nomination signature from Eli," he said, "but he's already signed it." Marcy looked down at the folder. Her hands trembled slightly, as they often did, but this time not from fear. This was the tremble of someone holding something that could change who they were. She looked up. "Did you ever notice this warehouse doesn't have windows?" she asked. Colton nodded. "I've noticed. I think that's why people didn't see themselves rotting." It stopped Colton cold. He had always assumed the lack of windows was for security, efficiency, light control, but he'd never considered that maybe, just maybe, it was the absence of sunlight that made people forget how to even look at themselves. That afternoon, Emilia was called up to the temporary office, not to be questioned, but to be restored. Eli had told Colton he deserves shift choice. Emilio's back can't take 7 straight hours standing anymore. Colton nodded and manually adjusted the schedule in the system. Starting next week, Emilio would work 4 hours each morning, take a break at lunch, and, if his health allowed, help onboard new staff afterward. Emilio took the new schedule, saying nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Colton, voice low but steady. "I've worked here 9 years. No one's ever asked me if I wanted different hours." "And now?" Colton asked. "Now I feel like maybe this isn't a place I need to leave anymore." Colton didn't need anything more than that. He stepped out of the office and passed through the break area, where the old vending machine had, just that morning, been replaced with a new one. The company logo now gleamed on its side. Marcy sat in a corner, reading her training folder, her hands still trembling a little. But no one laughed. No one whispered. Maybe because they all saw that something had changed, not in the system, but in themselves. Colton turned away, walking toward the end of the corridor, where the light of day spilled through a warehouse door left half open. He stood there, one hand resting against the frame, eyes gazing through the gap. Not because he was waiting for someone to arrive, but because he knew sometimes a door, quietly shut for years, can still be opened from the inside. Monday morning. Exactly 1 week after the fateful twist at Depot 9, the warehouse had begun to stabilize. But Colton Reeves knew one thing for certain. Stability wasn't a destination. It was only the point of departure. And this time, he couldn't afford to miss a single whisper. Late last week, during a meeting with the HR and legal teams, he requested immediate approval of a proposal he himself had once rejected 2 years prior. Establishing an independent space where employees could voice complaints without going through management, without needing email, without having to ask for permission to be safe. And today, the Advocate Room officially opened at Depot 9. Not large, just a repurposed space from Auxiliary Warehouse 2, but quiet enough, private enough, and most importantly, no supervisor had a key. A wooden plaque was mounted at the door, engraved with the words, "Your voice, your name, your right to be heard." Inside were chairs, a whiteboard, a desktop computer connected directly to the regional office, secured, encrypted, with data transmitted straight to headquarters. The person in charge wasn't a manager, wasn't someone from internal HR, but an independent advocate from the regional team. Kristen Ward, 36, a former factory worker turned labor mediator. Someone who once knew what it felt like to be silenced, and now lived to break that silence. When Kristen met the morning shift team for the first time, she didn't start with a speech. She simply said, "I'm not here to supervise. I'm here to prove that someone is listening." The first applause in the warehouse in years broke out, not because of who she was, but because finally a door had opened and no one stood in front of it. After introducing Kristen, Colton walked to the break area, where the new vending machine now had a hot water dispenser, tea, and a message board with ready-made sticky notes. He gave one directive. From this day forward, all internal safety reports, including concerns, incidents, and corrective actions, would be posted here publicly. No names if the sender wished to remain anonymous, but no filters, no pre-screening, no awaiting legal clearance. The board would be updated every Monday and Friday. And then something unexpected happened. Workers began writing their own slogans by hand and sticking them to the blank wall beside the report board. Not printed posters, not part of any campaign, just handwritten notes in blue, red, black marker. Different colors, different voices. One person wrote, "Night shift deserves daylight too." Another, "We don't need motivation. We need conditions." Tasha, who had once been forced to haul pallets while her leg was still injured, stepped forward and stuck up a small yellow slip, the handwriting slightly slanted but bold. "Kindness is a standard, not a reward." The room fell silent. A woman nearby nodded. Devin, his leg still bandaged, moved closer. No one spoke loudly. No one needed to. The wall spoke for them. And for the first time in years, it wasn't just a wall. It was a place where people dared to leave proof that they had existed. From the back of the warehouse, Eli quietly said to Colton, "I used to think that once trust was lost, it took forever to rebuild. But maybe people just need to know they won't be erased again." Colton nodded. He didn't smile, because he still knew he owed something. But today, at least, he had begun to repay it. In the afternoon meeting, Kristen made an announcement. Any act of coercion, silencing, or retaliatory threats against workers will be addressed immediately. Terminations will not require second-round approvals. The law is the law, and speech is a right, not a request. A worker in the back asked, "What if I was already warned for speaking out before? What happens now?" Kristen looked at him. "Then now you know, if it happens again, the one who gets the warning won't be you." That sentence spread like a quiet fire, finally finding oxygen. No applause followed, but someone walked to the whiteboard and wrote in bold letters, "Silence used to be survival. Now it's time to live." At the end of the day, Colton returned to the side office. He stopped in front of the advocate room. He didn't step inside. He just stood there looking at the nameplate, one hand gently resting against the wall. Now covered in taped notes, felt-tip messages, smudged ink. And for the first time, the wall answered back. Tuesday morning. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting. But at Depot 9, everyone knew. Today was different. Carlos Grady was back. The brown-skinned man with curly hair just beginning to gray at the temples had been terminated from the system 3 years ago for being too indecisive in managing staff. At the time, it was Colton himself who signed the termination order, not because of any wrongdoing, but because Carlos didn't fit the strategy of maximum output, minimum training. But today, Colton met him at the front gate. This time, he said, "I don't need you to teach them how to lift boxes. I need you to teach them how to be seen." Carlos smiled gently. "I never stopped thinking about that unfinished training chart from Depot 4. It's still hanging in my garage." Colton nodded. "Then let's finish it, starting here, from Depot 9. The warehouse's temporary break room was cleared out and fitted with more chairs and desks. Training sessions were held on site. No PowerPoint, no projector slides. Carlos went back to his old-school style, handwriting, asking each person's name, sketching the workflow like a city map, where every intersection was a real human being, with their own limits and their own story. The first session had only 12 signups. By the end of the week, over 30 people voluntarily joined, including workers who had never once stepped inside the HR office. Marcy became the unofficial assistant instructor. Devin was assigned hands-on first aid practice. Emilio sat in the front row, his hands still trembling from degeneration, but his eyes sharper than the whiteboard. "I'm not good with words," Emilio said during one discussion, "but I know this much. A warehouse without windows is something that kills people, slowly and in silence." No one interrupted. Carlos wrote that sentence on the board, word for word, and underlined it 3 times. "Starting next week," Colton said, "new hires won't be thrown into this place like a maze anymore. They'll start here, with Carlos, with a full diagram, with the right to ask and the right to stop if they don't understand." No applause, but someone quietly took a picture of the diagram. Someone else copied the safety protocols into a personal notebook. That same week, Colton organized the first open feedback session in the company's history. No stage, no microphone. Each person simply had to write down their name, shift, and one thing that was draining them. Suggestions poured in like a flood. "Stop switching our shifts constantly. We need to sleep on time." Separate new workers from the veterans, so no one has to pretend they know everything. Let us trade shifts if someone's family's in the hospital. Colton didn't respond directly. Instead, he nodded to Kristen from the advocate room, who stood and said, "Starting today, every suggestion will be publicly evaluated, given a signed response, and if denied, must include a clear reason why. No one would ever be a discarded opinion again." Eli suggested that each crew should have an internal safety representative, someone not under administrative management, but with the power to pause operations if safety standards weren't met. What once sounded like an impossible idea was approved in less than a day. Marcy was appointed as safety rep for Bay 2. Emilio led the pallet inspection team. Devin managed protective gear distribution. Those who had once suffered in silence were now the very people balancing the system, not because they were the best, but because they had once been broken and knew exactly where the limits were. That afternoon, Carlos rehung the old diagram he had once left unfinished. It was reprinted, framed, and placed beside the office door. Human-centered loading protocol, a model of operation designed around the human being. Colton stood there for a while, taking it in. Next to the diagram, written in chalk, was one line: "Blueprints are only blue until someone lives in them." Friday. The wind blew hard across the Depot 9 lot, kicking up pale dust from the concrete yard and carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut wood all the way to the warehouse doors. Inside there was no music, no ribbon to cut, just a long oak plaque over 1 meter wide, placed right at the heart of Dock 9, where once there had been shouting, hurried footsteps, and layers of silence packed tight like cement pressed into the mine. Colton Reeves stood there without a microphone. To his left stood Kristen from the advocate room. To his right, Carlos, his fingers still stained with ink from the schematic he'd posted up that morning. In front of them were not workers, but people, standing tall, no longer looking at the floor like they had the first time Colton walked into that warehouse under the name Mitch Carter. There was no long speech. No, "We did it." No, "Let's give ourselves a hand." Only Colton, voice calm like a morning breath. "I don't want to leave behind a system." He looked around. The pallets now neatly stacked, the new safety cameras installed, the shift boards updated with not just names but health statuses, and a new column titled "Flexible Time Off." "I want to leave behind a standard." No one clapped, but someone nodded. Someone else quietly pulled out their phone, not to record a video, but to capture the moment, the faces, the words, as if saving a copy for the soul. Then Colton turned to the wall beside Dock 9. Once just a cold slab of white concrete, Carlos laid a hand on the wooden frame. Kristen tightened the final screw, and the plaque was mounted. No golden nails, no red ribbon. Just wood, screws, and words carved by the very people once told to stay silent. In this place, no voice disappears, no name fades, and no silence is wasted. No one spoke, but Devin, his legs still scarred, reached out and lightly touched the corner of the plaque with his fingertip. Marcy stood motionless, eyes locked on every carved line. Emilio, as promised, brought a small piece of white chalk and wrote beneath the engraving in his own uneven hand. "We're still here." Kristen smiled. "That's all it needs," she said. Colton didn't walk up to a stage, because there was no stage. He simply moved quietly along the warehouse floor, shaking hands one by one. Not performative, but sincere. When he reached Eli, he paused. "I don't need to check anymore," he said. "I know who's standing at the door now." Eli nodded. "I'm not standing here to keep anyone out. I'm here to make sure no one walks out and leaves someone behind." Colton said nothing. He turned and walked toward the rear exit. Along the way, he glanced up at one of the newly installed cameras, not as a tool for monitoring, but for preserving. Each time someone passed beneath it, data would be logged to the advocate room. No one had deletion rights. For the first time, surveillance existed to protect, not control. No one saw Colton off, and no one needed to, because he didn't leave like someone finishing a mission. He slipped away quietly, like someone who used to guard the night, and now knows when the light no longer needs his flashlight. A week later, he returned. No announcement, no suit, no assistant. Kristen saw him from across the floor and gave a quiet nod. No one shouted. No one said, "The CEO's here." Only Marcy turned to a new hire and whispered, "He's not here to check on us. He's here to make sure no one has to apologize for surviving." From that day forward, Colton visited once a week. No fixed schedule. Some days he showed up during loading. Some days he spent time in the advocate room. One day he just came to leave a small bag of pastries next to the water cooler, with no name on it. No one was ever told in advance, but everyone knew. Ever since the oak plaque was hung, there hadn't been a single day at Depot 9 where anyone felt left behind. At the base of the wall, beneath the carved lines, someone had scribbled in pencil, so small you had to stand close to see it. Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs someone to stay. Maybe you've worked somewhere like Depot 9. Maybe you've known someone like Marcy, quiet, capable, and constantly overlooked. Or maybe you've stayed silent when something felt wrong because you didn't believe your voice would matter. But in this warehouse, everything changed. Not because someone shouted louder, but because someone finally stayed long enough to listen. If this story moved you, if it made you feel anything, hope, anger, compassion, leave a comment. Tell us who you saw yourself in. Because sometimes the smallest stories carry the biggest truths. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, hit subscribe. We don't just tell stories. We tell what silence too often hides.